Maybe you clicked here out of curiosity, or maybe, without realizing it, you were looking for a quiet corner, a place where words take their time, and even silence has its place. I wrote this story carefully, like stitching together memories, hurts, and small discoveries, hoping that somewhere along the way, a part of it feels like yours too. If that happens, even for a moment, stay. Listen for as long as you'd like, and if you feel like leaving a small sign that you were here, a simple "I'm here" in the comments, a like, or even sharing this with someone can mean more than you think. They always said I was born lucky, not because I worked harder than anyone else, but because every time I fell, someone else paid for the landing. That someone was usually my parents. When I was a kid, failure didn't stick to me. If I bombed a school project, Mom would have a word with the teacher. If I quit the basketball team mid-season, Dad would tell everyone it was because I was focusing on my studies. Every stumble, every poor choice, they had a way of rebranding it as something noble. And I let them. Why wouldn't I? The safety net was always there. Then there was my sister. Quiet, steady, always in the background. While I chased shiny ideas and quick wins, she was the one clearing dishes, watching our younger cousins, working shifts after school. Mom called her helpful. Dad called her responsible. But to me, she was forgettable. A placeholder in the family photo. Nice to have around, but not the headline act. I was the headline. I was the story they wanted to tell. Fast forward to my 20s. 3 business ventures, 3 dramatic failures. The first collapsed under debt. The second burned through investors' patience faster than cash. The third? Well, I still don't like thinking about the third. By the time it folded, I was broke. Not tight on cash, broke. I mean empty accounts, unpaid loans, and the kind of phone calls that make your stomach twist. The condo I'd been so proud to buy? Gone. The friends I used to wine and dine? Silent. The only place left to go was home. When I called, my mother didn't hesitate. "Of course, Nate, we'll make room." Her voice was warm, almost relieved, like she'd been waiting for me to admit defeat. But then Dad added, "We'll need to move some things around to give you the space you deserve. The guest room isn't big enough for you to focus." I didn't think much of it, not until I realized whose room was being reassigned. They weren't talking about moving me into the guest room. They were talking about moving me into my sister's room. Her room, the one she'd had since childhood, the one place in the house that was hers, was about to become mine. And in my mind, it made sense. She'd understand. She always did. The arrangements my parents talked about happened faster than I expected. By the time I got home from signing the last of the bankruptcy paperwork, Mom was already in my sister's hallway with a roll of packing tape and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Don't worry," she said, sealing a box. "She'll be fine in the basement for a while. You need a proper space to get back on your feet." Fine in the basement? The thought flickered in my mind, but I pushed it away. It wasn't like I was kicking her out of the house. She still had a roof, a bed, technically. I told myself she'd understand. She'd always been the reasonable one. The one who gave up the last slice of cake without a fuss, who worked extra hours so Dad wouldn't have to. Why wouldn't she do this for me? After all, I was the one in crisis. When I stepped into what was now my room, it was almost unrecognizable. Her posters were gone, leaving pale rectangles on the wall. The desk where she used to write, cleared, drawers empty. Even the faint scent of her lavender candles had been replaced by the sharp, clean smell of furniture polish. My things were already half unpacked, courtesy of Mom. My suit jackets hung neatly in her old closet, my watch box on her dresser. It felt unsettling, like walking into someone else's life and pretending it was yours. That's when I heard the front door open. Her footsteps, light but quick, came down the hall. She froze in the doorway, grocery bags still in hand. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the missing pieces of her life, the boxes labeled in Mom's neat handwriting. We stared at each other for a second too long. I forced a smile, tried to keep it light. Hey, thanks for clearing out so fast. Her expression didn't change. No anger, no tears, just a cold stillness I'd never seen on her face before. It wasn't the look of someone inconvenienced. It was the look of someone who had just been told exactly how much, or how little, they mattered. And for the first time, a small knot of guilt twisted in my gut. But I swallowed it down. I told myself, this is temporary. She'll get over it. She always does. That first night, she didn't say a word. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just a quiet shuffle of footsteps down to the basement, arms wrapped tightly around herself. I listened from my new room, hearing the creak of the basement stairs and the hollow thud of the door closing behind her. Part of me expected an argument. She'd always been the more patient one, yes, but this was her room, her space. I thought maybe she'd come storming back up to demand it, but the house stayed still. Over dinner, Mom waved a hand dismissively. She'll adjust, it's just a room. Dad nodded in agreement. She's tough, she'll get over it. I wanted to believe them, and I did, because it was easier than thinking about the look she'd given me in the doorway. Days passed in that strange quiet. She left early for errands, came home late, and barely touched the food on her plate. When our paths crossed in the hallway, she didn't avoid me. But she didn't see me either. It was like I'd become a shadow in her peripheral vision. Then one morning, I woke to the smell of fresh coffee and realized the basement door was wide open. Her blanket was folded neatly on the couch down there. The air had that cold, empty feel, like no one had slept there in days. Upstairs, in the hallway where her boxes had once been stacked, there was nothing. No note, no text, no explanation, just absence. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the space she'd left behind. A strange, hollow feeling crept in. Not guilt exactly, but something close to it. And yet, as the day went on, the demands of my own mess swallowed it up. Bills to pay, jobs to chase, a reputation to salvage. By the next morning, I'd filed her disappearance somewhere deep in the back of my mind, out of sight, out of mind. At least, that's what I told myself. 6 months crawled by, each one heavier than the last. I told myself I was between opportunities. But the truth was simpler. No one wanted to hire a man with 3 failed businesses and a reputation for burning through money. Every interview started the same way. Polite smiles, a handshake, a glance at my resume. Then came the subtle shift, their eyes narrowing as they recognized my name, remembering headlines or whispered gossip. By the time I left, the position was no longer available or already filled. The few investments I still clung to, gone. One partner backed out without warning, another ghosted entirely. Each loss tightened the circle around me, and that circle was getting very small. Friends who once filled my weekends stopped answering my calls. Drinks and dinner invitations dried up. It turned out loyalty was a lot like money. Easy to spend, hard to get back. At home, the atmosphere changed too. Mom's voice carried a sharper edge. Dad started sighing when the grocery bill came in. They still defended me when speaking to others, but inside our walls, the cracks were obvious. One night at dinner, Mom muttered, "Your sister's as stubborn as ever. We still can't reach her." Dad shook his head. "She's impossible. Won't answer calls, won't reply to messages." I poked at my food, saying nothing. A part of me wanted to ask for her number, to try myself. But another part, the louder part, told me not to. Why should I be the one to reach out? She'd left. She'd made her choice. Still, sometimes, late at night, I caught myself wondering, where was she sleeping? Was she still working herself to the bone in some diner? Or had she found something better, something bigger? I told myself the questions didn't matter. But the truth was, they did. I just wasn't ready to admit it. Almost 3 years had passed since she left. 3 years of me chasing leads, pitching ideas, and watching them crumble like sand through my fingers. The savings were gone. The patience in my parents' eyes, gone too. I'd stopped aiming high. Instead, I sat at my laptop day after day, shotgun blasting my resume to anything that even hinted at a paycheck. Most replies were automated rejections, if I got a reply at all. Then, one afternoon, a posting caught my eye. Small but reputable branding agency. Local roots, but a growing international client list. They specialized in helping struggling businesses reimagine themselves. It sounded like exactly the kind of place that might take a chance on someone with a colorful background. I didn't think twice. I tailored my cover letter, polished my resume, and hit send. No research, no digging into who ran the place. I was too tired to care about the details. I just needed a yes from somewhere. A few days later, I came home to find my parents waiting in the living room. Not sitting casually, but waiting. The way people do when they've been talking about you before you walked in. Dad's jaw was tight. Mom held a printed email in one hand, my resume in the other. Without a word, she tossed them onto the coffee table. The email was short, almost casual in tone. Forwarding this in case you still have a room for Nate at home. Beneath the message was my resume, the one I'd sent to that branding agency. And above it, in the signature line, was the name of the company's CEO. It wasn't an unfamiliar name. It was hers, my sister's. The air left my lungs in a slow, cold rush. For a long moment, all I could do was stare at the page. 3 years ago, I'd stood in her doorway, claiming the space she'd called hers. Now, without even realizing it, I'd just knocked on hers, and she'd answered in a way I'd never forget. The ground under me felt different. Not like it was collapsing. More like it had shifted, and I was the one suddenly off balance. My parents didn't speak right away. Mom smoothed the edge of the printed email, avoiding my eyes. Dad cleared his throat like he was about to explain something, then stopped. They weren't used to being on the receiving end of her message. None of us were. For years, she'd been the quiet one, the agreeable one. Now, she was the one setting the terms. I felt the heat rise in my face. Part of it was embarrassment, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your stomach churn. But the other part was anger, and it wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed at me, because I'd walked right into this. I'd sent out resumes without a thought. I hadn't even considered that she might have built something of her own. And now, I was the punchline in a story I didn't control. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the images from my head. Her in a diner uniform, balancing plates for strangers. Her crouched on the cold basement floor, unpacking a thin blanket without complaint. Her hauling bags of groceries up the stairs while I was on the phone chasing some doomed business lead. I had called those years hard for me, but for her, they had been brutal, and we'd all acted like it was normal. The truth hit me like a slow, heavy weight. I'd lived most of my life on a cushion someone else had to provide, and she had lived hers cleaning up the pieces when that cushion failed me. For the first time, the balance of our history didn't feel like an accident. It felt like theft. And I was the one who'd been stealing. It was Dad who suggested it. We should all go. Together. Apologize. Mom hesitated, but eventually nodded. I didn't say much, just agreed, because part of me needed to see her. Not to make peace exactly, but to find out who she had become. I didn't expect forgiveness. I wasn't sure I even deserved a conversation. 2 days later, we stood in the lobby of her company's headquarters, a sleek glass building in the middle of the city. The air smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Muted jazz hummed from hidden speakers. It was a space that felt intentional, like every inch had been designed with purpose. The receptionist greeted us with a polite smile, then picked up the phone. "She'll be right out." I glanced around at the walls lined with framed awards, magazine covers, and photos of smiling clients from places I'd only ever dreamed of visiting. Her name was everywhere, in bold print, in engraved plaques, in signatures that closed multi-million-dollar deals. Then she appeared. No fanfare, no dramatic entrance. Just a calm, steady walk from the hallway, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. Her posture was straight, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at me first. Her eyes swept over the three of us, pausing briefly on Mom and Dad, before finally landing on mine. There was no smirk, no glare. Just a quiet composure that made me feel small, like I was a guest in a world I hadn't earned the right to enter. And in that moment, I realized she didn't have to raise her voice to make me feel the weight of the distance between us. Mom went first. Her voice was barely above a whisper. We were wrong. We didn't realize how badly we treated you." Dad followed, his tone stiff but sincere. "We thought we were helping the family. We see now that it was at your expense." She nodded politely, like she'd heard those words before, but wasn't ready to let them sink in. Then her eyes shifted to me. I hadn't planned on saying anything. Not really. But standing there, with the walls of her success around me, and the weight of my failures pressing in, I realized silence would be worse. So, I took a breath. "I'll say it straight," I began. "I was wrong. You've become everything I once said you'd never be. And I was arrogant enough to think I'd always be ahead of you. I was wrong about that too." Her gaze didn't soften, but she didn't look away. It was the kind of silence that forces you to hold your own words and taste their truth. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "You won't get special treatment here, Nate. If you really want to start over, the only place I can offer you is an internship. Entry level. From zero." The word zero landed heavier than I expected. Not as an insult, but as a reminder. This would be the first time in my life that I wouldn't start halfway up the ladder. I swallowed hard, nodded once. "All right, from zero." Her eyes stayed on mine for a moment longer, as if measuring whether I meant it. Then she turned, gesturing toward a side door. "HR is down the hall. If you're serious, you'll start Monday." And just like that, the conversation was over. Not a reconciliation, not a clean slate. Just an open door with no guarantee I could keep it. My first day as an intern was exactly what I'd always feared. Invisible. No corner office, no introductions as the CEO's brother, no soft landing. Just a desk wedged between the supply cabinet and the coffee machine. A login to the company's internal system, and a list of small tasks no one else wanted to do. I told myself it was temporary. But as the weeks passed, I realized temporary had a way of stretching out when you weren't pulling your weight. No one cared about my failed businesses, my visionary ideas, or the stories I used to tell at networking events. What they cared about was whether I could deliver the spreadsheet by 3 p.m., proofread a client proposal without missing a typo, or haul boxes to the storage room without complaining. And they didn't go easy on me because of who I was. In fact, it felt like they went harder, testing whether I'd crumble or adapt. Every time I cut corners, it showed. Every time I got defensive, it cost me trust. The late nights were the worst. When the office was quiet and the glow from my monitor was the only light, my mind wandered back to the basement. I pictured her unpacking that thin blanket, folding herself into a space no one should have to live in, while I slept upstairs without a thought for how it felt to be displaced. I remembered standing in her doorway, thanking her for clearing out so fast, as if she'd done me a favor instead of losing her home. Those memories didn't fade. They sharpened, cutting through the excuses I'd built for years. So I stopped talking and started listening. I learned how to take criticism without turning it into an argument. I asked questions, even if it made me look inexperienced. And slowly, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Respect. Not just from others, but from myself. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't quick. But for the first time, I was building something from the bottom without anyone holding the safety net. 1 year later, I wasn't the same man who'd walked into that lobby with my parents. The intern's desk by the supply cabinet was gone, replaced by a workstation in the main office. I had a title now, a salary I earned, and projects with my name attached to them. But more than that, I had proof, to myself, and maybe to her, that I could stand without the crutches I'd leaned on my whole life. We still didn't act like siblings in the way people imagine. There were no inside jokes from childhood, no long heart-to-hearts over coffee. Instead, we were something different. Allies. Two people bound by the same history, but walking separate paths toward futures we chose ourselves. There was a kind of respect in that distance, and it was enough. Our parents stayed on the edges of my life. Polite messages on holidays, the occasional phone call that felt more like an obligation than a connection. They never fully bridged the gap with her either. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. The only time the past tried to creep back in was over dinner one night. Mom set down her glass and said, almost casually, "You know, we've been thinking, maybe it's time to bring the family together. Work together, like it used to be." She looked at my sister, expectant. My sister's smile was calm, her tone gentle but unshakable. That door closed a long time ago. The conversation ended there. No raised voices, no arguments, just the quiet understanding that some bridges aren't rebuilt, not out of anger, but because the other side was never safe to stand on. Later that night, lying in my own apartment, one I'd paid for, one I'd earned, I thought about what I'd lost. It wasn't the room I'd taken from her, or the money that had slipped through my fingers. It was something harder to replace. The trust of someone who had always been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it. And I knew that no promotion, no paycheck, no success could buy that back.